Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. While we wait, if you've just joined us, please let us know where you're watching from tonight in chat. I can see there's people from all over Australia. We've got Toowoomba, quite a few from Melbourne. They're in lockdown like us in Sydney. So thank you so much for joining us. Someone from Canberra, smoky Sydney. It was very smoky today in Sydney. If you've just joined us, everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. We'd love to hear where you're from. So please jump on chat and let us know. Barrel, Sutherland. We've still got people coming in. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We'll get started in a minute or so. While we wait, we'd love to hear where you're from. If you could open chat and just pop that into chat. It's great to see so many people from all over Australia. Someone from Cherrybrook. I went to school in Cherrybrook, so that's a cool spot in Sydney. All right. We'll just wait another couple of minutes. We've still got people coming in. While we wait, I'll just let you know we do have 20% off all of our brands at the moment. NiSi, Explorer, Series, Sunway Photo. It's a great time to buy, a great price at 20% off. And we would certainly appreciate the support after being locked down for the last 8 weeks in Sydney. So yeah, please head over to the websites. You'll automatically get 20% off with the lockdown sale we've got at the moment. All right, we've still got a few people coming in. We'll get started in a minute or so. If you've just joined us, thank you so much. We'd love if you could jump on chat and just let us know where you're watching from tonight. It's great to see so many people from all over Australia joining us. All right, we might kick it off. If I could just ask if you could please put yourself on mute just while I'm presenting, and I'll stop throughout the presentation. There'll be plenty of times where you can turn your microphone on and ask a question. But just during the presentation, if you could please just mute yourself, that would be great. All right, we've still got a few people coming in, but we'll get kicked off. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name's Andrew, and I'm part of the NiSi team in Sydney. As many of you who are joining us tonight have been in lockdown for 8 weeks. So I'm so glad to see so many people. It's the most people I've probably seen at once in months, and can't wait to talk your ear off about filters for the next hour or so. So in case I lose track of time between talking ND filters and polarisers, you may want to grab a drink and settle in now. And I hope you enjoy this introduction to filters. Now, just a little bit about me. I've worked for NiSi for about 6 years. It's great to be involved with a brand that's active in the photographic community, as well as with a product that has a massive impact on images. And it's really rewarding because you can see that difference on the back of a camera when you use the product and when you don't use the product. And it's always rewarding talking to people and showing people how to use the product when you can see such a difference. Now, tonight's all about an introduction to filters. So if you know everything about filters, it might be a good time to go and grab a second drink. But for everyone else, we'll basically go through where to start with filters, why we use filters, what effects they can achieve, and what filters to use in different situations. After each section, I'll take some questions. So feel free to, if you've got a question, it won't be too long until you can answer that question. Also, feel free to drop it into chat if you've got a question, and I can either pick it up from there, or I've got Jason from our team here as well. He'll see it and ask it for us. There'll also be heaps of time at the end for questions as well, if you've got any questions. Now, before I started working for NiSi, photography was my passion, which is what led me into the industry. I love shooting studio portraits and creating studio portraits with flash. I love the challenge of working with others to create an image, usually a single image from a studio session. But what's great about it is you create the light, you create the shadows, and there's lots of problem solving until you reach that final vision. I know it's a really geeky, but I absolutely enjoy it. It's heaps of fun. And that's how I originally got into photography. What shooting in the studio has taught me is how to look at light and how to look at shadows, which I believe has made me a better all-round photographer. I encourage any photographer to start experimenting with all different types of photography. It will make you a better photographer the more you practice and the more you learn, whether it's the genre that you want to be in or another genre of photography. You will definitely learn something. I always had a passion for getting outdoors, and I love photographing seascapes, sunrises, sunsets, and nightscapes. I got my first set of filters a few years into my photographic journey, which was a plastic set of cheap filters. And I started to see how controlling time in my photos added to the story and to the final image. Filters allowed me to bring dynamic elements into my image and also remove distracting elements. And what I discovered soon was filters were almost the secret sauce that many popular landscape photographers use that I looked up to. So here's a few images that I've shot with NiSi filters. The one on the left is taken from one of my, I guess, most favorite locations, Tasman Lake in New Zealand. On the right is a shot from the Mornington Peninsula. This shot was taken with a 3-stop ND filter to get a ½ second exposure to capture that water as it was receding out. Here are 2 images shot with the Natural Night filter, which is a filter I'll go into more in detail towards the latter part of the presentation. So another photo from New Zealand, and then a drone image taken with one of our drone filters. Another drone image taken with a CPL filter. Most of the images I love to shoot these days are long exposures. I regularly challenge myself to shoot exposures of over 3 minutes. It really helps me to practice my skills in calculating exposure times while using ND filters. What's great about it is it allows me to remove distractions from busy places like beaches, show movement like this image, which has got some dynamic cloud movement. Now at NiSi, we make hundreds of filters, and I've got access to any filter, but I actually have a very specific amount of filters that I usually take with me. I use the 100mm system because I find it nice and compact. It suits all of the lenses that I've got. And here's the filters that I use. I use a 3 to 15 stop ND. It's great to have a range of ND filters because as the light changes, you can change the filter. An example is you can use a 15 stop in the middle of the day to get you quite a long exposure, whereas a 3 stop is not going to have any effect during the midday sun. I then have a range of grad filters. The one I use definitely the most for probably 90% of my images is a medium 3 stop. And we'll go into all of the grad filters and what each filter does throughout the presentation. So let's talk about filters and how they can take your photography to a new creative level. Not many products can add to your photography the way filters can to create such a dramatic change in your images. When I teach workshops, I always make a point to ask participants to shoot without a filter and then add the filter so they can see the difference on the back of the camera. Just say I bought a couple of brand new cameras, one cost $1,000 and one cost $20,000, and I shoot the same scene. I know on the back of the camera, I won't see much difference, but add a 10 stop onto either of those cameras and you'll see a dramatic difference in the image that you can capture. Now let's start with some inspiration. We love seeing what photographers create with our filters, and here's a few images that have been shared with us. So this first one is a beautiful long exposure that's used in ND filters to increase the exposure time, to smooth out the water, and to create some movement in the sky and soften those clouds. This was an image taken with the NiSi Natural Night filter, which has removed the yellow glow from the city. And this is just a stunning, beautiful night image. This is an image taken with a CPL to increase the saturation of the greens and a medium grad to balance the exposure between the sky and the foreground. This was an image taken with a 10 stop ND to give that really nice, smooth, misty look in the water. And you can see there's also some cloud movement and then a GND or grad filter to balance the exposure between the sky and the foreground. Now, filters can allow us to capture a scene over time, showing movement and allowing us to add effects in a creative way. Sometimes they allow us to capture a scene how we've seen it, rather than be limited by the dynamic range of the camera. Let me also tell you that sometimes adding a filter is not the best option. I recommend using filters if it's going to give you a better result, or if you want to create a specific dynamic effect or image. There are some scenes where I will take multiple exposures and blend them in post, rather than use a grad filter. There's some scenes that I won't use a filter at all. When you get comfortable knowing what a filter can do, you're also comfortable knowing when to use them. Now, first we're going to look at ND filters. ND filters or neutral density filters come in all shapes and sizes. They have a simple job. They reduce the amount of light coming into the camera. By controlling the amount of light coming into the camera, it allows us to extend our shutter speed to capture over time and capture movement. Showing this movement and time, I believe, can turn an ordinary image into a great image and really show a sense of story. Most of you would know about the exposure triangle. We always need to achieve an exposed image. Now, this image was taken over a 3-minute exposure, shot at ISO 100 at f10. Now, here's a quick quiz for you to make sure you're listening. Just say we were to take an image at ISO 100 and f10 during the middle of the day. and we set the shutter speed to 3 minutes with no ND filter, what would our result be? It'd be a pure white image. A 3-minute exposure with no ND filter would be pure white. So with an ND filter, it allows us to create a 3-minute exposure during the day, which is impossible unless you've got an ND filter. ND filters are great at allowing us to control the shutter speed, and they're also often used in video and other types of photography to have a wider aperture. For an example, you're able to shoot a portrait at f2.8 in full daylight using a flash in the middle of the day. Now, here's a diagram of our ideal camera settings for landscape photography. It's basically a landscape exposure triangle, you could say. Now, as landscape photographers, we know we want to maximize our quality. So that involves shooting at ISO 100 or 200 or the lowest we kind of can or our camera will allow. We want to maximize our focus throughout an image. So that means we want an aperture somewhere between f8 and f16. So that basically leaves the shutter speed, and this is where we can be creative. Now, let me show you a few examples. In this image, an ND1000 or 10 stop has been used to extend the shutter speed to 2 minutes. It has smoothed out the water and softened the clouds. And I believe it's created a beautiful image with less distraction. You can see the exposure over the two images is the same, but what the filter's done is allowed us to capture a much longer exposure. This is an image that I showed earlier in the presentation. This is the before and after. Now, this is a 90-second exposure, and I believe has turned this image from, I guess, a fairly standard, ordinary kind of image into something quite great, quite dynamic. It's got the water movement, it's got softened clouds. The whole image is just soft, it's gentle, it's quite beautiful, and ND filters can really have that effect on your images. Now, here's what a long exposure shot in the midday full sun at a beach on the Central Coast in New South Wales. Now, before someone asks, you may see that the bin and the A-frame and the witch's hat have been removed. We don't have filters that can do that. I did that in post-production. But what you can see in this image is that 15 stop has removed some distractions from the image. There's less people, but what it has done is it's brought some dynamics into the image by showing cloud movement over those 3 minutes. One thing that excites me about ND filters is that it opens up your shooting time from just shooting at sunrise and sunset to being able to shoot all day. Now, on a side note, another benefit of shooting with an ND filter over a long exposure is if you look closely at this image, you'll see the red pole leading up to the tower. There's actually, it reduces the contrast. So there's more light on the red pole on the long exposure image. So what are the ideal shutter speeds and what effects can we achieve? Well, here's a few examples. A ½ a second exposure is great to get that seascape water flow, like this image that I showed you earlier. A ½ a second to 5 seconds is great to capture moving traffic or an object that's moving. 2 to 10 seconds is great to capture waterfalls. Keeping in mind, you want to smooth out the waterfall water, but still retain some texture in it. Then 30 to 60 seconds is great for smoothing out water or creating that misty water or doing some longer light trails. And 2 to 5 minutes is great for capturing cloud movement and softening those clouds. So those are typically the effects that we want to try and achieve with ND filters. Now, before we get into how to calculate our new exposure time, do we have a question or no?
Yes,
Okay,
we've got a question that's come
Go
through,
for it.
Andrew. So one of the images, so Erin Garlick has asked, so you were able to catch stars in the city with a night filter, as it, like a bit disbelieving. Will you be able to capture the Milky Way, and do you need to pre-focus to infinity before using the night filter?
Yeah, so you can capture stars shooting in the city. It can be quite difficult, but it can be done. You can capture the Milky Way in the city as well, or just out of the city. There's plenty of places where you can capture the Milky Way. Obviously, a darker spot is better. It is quite difficult capturing it in the city because of the amount of light. But if you jump on YouTube, there's plenty of videos of people that have done it. The best thing to try and do is either focus to infinity, or sometimes you can see stars when you're in the city. There are a few bright ones, so you can try and focus on one of the stars, either through live view or using your viewfinder. If you use that as a focus point, yeah, the stars should be in focus when you're shooting. But we will go more into using the natural night filter towards the end of the presentation. Okay. All right. Well, before we go into how to calculate new exposure times when using an ND filter, we first need to know how to calculate our base exposure without an ND filter. The base exposure is used in our calculation, so we need to make sure this is correct before we even start using an ND filter. Now, a base exposure is the shutter speed without your ND filter in place, with our ISO and aperture set. We can use our light meter in our camera in partnership with a histogram to calculate our base exposure. I've found, and teaching lots of workshops, it's very evident that you can't rely 100% on a light meter in a camera. But combined with a histogram, we're able to get a very good base exposure. I recommend to calculate your base exposure with a CPL in place and with a grad filter in place if you're using them. That way, the only change is the ND filter that we're adding. Now, as light changes, one thing you'll need to keep in mind is you'll need to keep recalculating your base exposure. Now, another point to note is that we set our ISO and we set our aperture in our base exposure, and they'll be the same in the longer exposure. So they almost become irrelevant when we're looking at the calculation. You won't need to, in an app, put your ISO or put your aperture, because they'll be constant. Now that leads us to one of the questions we get the most, is how do we calculate our new exposure time when we're using ND filters? So we've looked at the shutter speeds we need to achieve to create an effect. And we've calculated our base exposure without our ND filter on. We can then use an app to calculate our new exposure time or work out what filter is going to get us to the desired shutter speed. Now, there's heaps of free apps out there that will do this. We have a free, simple app to use. You can search for NiSi filters in the App Store or the Google Store to get that. Now, histograms are a great way to see if our shots are exposed correctly. It takes the guesswork and strain out of trying to see an image on a small screen on the back of a camera to see if all areas are exposed correctly. As we know, our exposure triangle is made up of our camera settings, our ISO, our shutter speed, and our aperture. But there is a fourth element that does affect our exposure, which is the amount of available light. So we need to be able to understand how to create a correctly exposed image. And reading our histogram is the best way to nail that exposure every time. Now, here's 3 examples of the same image, so you can see the histogram and see see the effect the exposure has on the images. Now, if we look at the left, if we get a spike on the left-hand side of our histogram, it's showing us that we've got pure black pixels or the image is very dark. Now, if we look at the right-hand side image, we've got a spike on the far right-hand side, and that's telling us that there's pure white pixels or the image is too bright. Now, as photographers, what we want to aim for is a histogram where there's no peaks on either side. And that means we've basically captured detail in every pixel and we're not losing detail. Our job as a photographer is to get the best exposure we can in camera. It means we can do more with it in post-production. We need to retain detail in as many pixels as we can, so we can process them later. Now, if we're underexposed and to the left, we've got pure black pixels and white pixels if we overexpose. So just repeating that, if we get pure black or pure white pixels, we can't process them later. They'll stay that way for good. Now, here's an example of using our app to calculate a new exposure time with a 10-stop filter. So you can select a filter at the top, and if you're stacking filters, what you can do is just basically calculate the amount of stops. If you're stacking, say, 2 6-stop filters, it'll give you 12 stops, and you can select 12 stops from the ND or the stops section there. Then what we do is we've calculated our base exposure using our camera's light meter and using the histogram with no ND filter on. That becomes our base exposure, and that's what we put under the basic shutter speed or base exposure. Then the app will calculate our new exposure time. So in this case, we've got a 10-stop filter. The base shutter speed was a 13th, and it gives us a shutter speed of 1 minute and 18 seconds. What you can then do is, as the light changes, you can keep using the app to calculate, use your light meter to calculate your base exposure, and then keep using the app to give you new exposure time. Now, the process for shooting a long exposure using an ND filter, I normally suggest people to set the CPL first. Make sure you rotate that, because it's easier to see what the CPL is doing before you add any other filters or add an ND filter. You can then add a graduated filter if you wanted to use one to balance the scene between, say, the sky and the foreground. We then calculate our base exposure using our camera's light meter and our histogram. Once we have that base exposure, if you're using a DSLR camera, I suggest that you change your focus to manual, because your camera won't be able to focus through, say, a 10 or a 15-stop filter. But just keep in mind, if you do change your composition, you'll need to reset your focus. The next step is we add the ND filter, we change over to bulb mode, and then we time our exposure and take the image. So that's the process on how to shoot with an ND filter, from basically setup all the way through. Now, as I mentioned, the exposure depends on our camera settings and the amount of available light. But here's a rough guide on the filters that you can use to achieve the effects that we discussed earlier. So for a 1/2-second exposure, to capture that water flow that we mentioned, a 3-stop ND is a great filter to use to do that. A 3 or a 6-stop is great to get that 1/2 second to 5-second exposure. To get an exposure time of 2 to 10 seconds, we're looking at either using just a CPL, which will give us usually 1 to 2 stops, or a 3-stop ND. 30 to 60 seconds, we can use a 6 or a 10-stop ND. Or if we're going for a much longer exposure, we need to look at a really dense ND filter, like a 10 stop if we're in low light, or a 15 stop during the day. But obviously, using an ND filter does depend on the amount of available light, and that's why we need to be able to calculate our base exposure to work out what the best filter is to use. Okay, is everyone still with me? How are we going so far? Do we have any questions on ND filters that I can answer before we get into grad filters?
I've only got a screw-in 9-stop filter. How do you get on without graduated density filter then? Do I have to buy a square format?
Yeah, I'll actually touch on that in the next section, but definitely grad filters are much easier as a square filter because you need to be able to move them up and down. You can get circular grad filters, but they're quite limiting on what you can shoot because you can't move them up and down.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, we've got one come through, Andrew, here. Just in terms of loading the ND and the grad, the NiSi instructions suggest that you put the ND in first, closest to the back of the camera. Do you leave that as a space until you determine the shutter speed, etc., and squeeze it in last? So do you take the base exposure and then put the filter in? Yep.
Yep, correct. So you definitely need the ND filter closest to the lens. But what I will typically do is obviously put the grad filter or GND filter in the second slot. And what I'll then do is just have my ND filter and just slide it in that spare slot in the back once I've got my base exposure. Now, the other thing you can do, which is a bit more on the advanced side, is you can put your grad filter on afterwards. But what you need to do is, when you're working out your base exposure, is work out your base exposure on your foreground because it's the darkest part of the image. Then you can add your grad filter afterwards, knowing it's going to darken that bright sky down. But if you meter and work off your base exposure off the sky, your foreground is going to be way too dark. But for most people, I would suggest the best way to do it is just leave the slot closest to your camera and put the ND filter in once you've got your base exposure. It's also easier that way to set up your polarizer and less fiddling and playing around. Cool. Any other questions? I see there's a question about benefits of circular versus drop-in. I'll definitely touch on that shortly, so we will get there. All right, so the next filters I wanted to touch on are GND filters or graduated filters. Now, they come in all shapes and sizes. A GND filter is designed to balance the exposure between the sky and the foreground. Typically, when we shoot sunrise and sunset, most of us will know the sky is much brighter than what the foreground is. In some situations, we can also use a GND filter upside down to actually darken the foreground. And an example of this might be if you're shooting at one of the beautiful tidal pools we have in Sydney here. They can have lights on them when you first get there in the morning for sunrise or sunset, and it's actually much brighter in the foreground than it is in the background. But typically, grad filters are used to darken the sky. Now, GND filters, as I just mentioned, work best with a square filter system. They're designed to be slid up and down to have an effect on the brightest part of the scene, which is usually the sky. In Australia, we love to shoot sunrise and sunset. So GND filters can help us get a great exposure in camera at these times. Now, GND filters are not perfect, and there's some situations where it's better to take multiple exposures and blend them in post. And I do this myself sometimes. if the situation doesn't suit a grad filter. So let's take a look at grad filters that we offer and when is the best situation to use them. First up is a soft G&D filter. What a soft filter is it's got a gradual transition from a dark to a light, and it's quite a large transition zone, which is about 5 centimeters. Now, these are best used when there's something breaking the horizon, like a mountain or a sea stack or a tall building, something where you can't see a defined straight horizon line that's quite tall, breaking that line. Medium graduated filters are similar to soft grads, but they have a smaller transition zone of about 3 centimeters instead of 5 centimeters. The medium graduated filter is the most versatile G&D filter, and it can be used in almost every situation. So if you only could buy one graduated filter, this is definitely the filter I would suggest buying. I myself use my medium G&D filter probably 90% of the shots that I take. Now, a hard graduated filter is used when a horizon line is clearly defined. So when you're shooting out to sea, or if you're high above everything, as an example might be shooting on a drone, when you're high above everything, it flattens out the horizon and creates that really straight, flat horizon line. A hard graduated filter is the least used graduated filter in Australia. And I think the reason for that is that we have so many great things to shoot in Australia, particularly up the coastline, like headlands and sea stacks and rocks and different things that make great elements in our photos. We typically don't find ourselves shooting out to sea where that flat horizon is that often. So it's not as popular here in Australia. Now, a very popular filter for us is a reverse graduated filter. Now, it's like a hard G&D filter, but the darkest part is actually in the middle of the frame rather than the top of the frame. And it gets lighter as it gets from the middle towards the top, and it's clear at the bottom. So reverse G&D is excellent for shooting sunrise and sunset when the brightest part of the scene is closest to the horizon, but you still need to use it in a situation where there's a fairly flat horizon line or a clearly defined horizon line. And we typically know, obviously, the sun is usually setting, is usually rising over the water for most of us, or if we're on the other side of Australia, setting over the water. But an example would be you couldn't use a reverse grad shooting a tall building or a tall mountain because with that darkest part in the center of the image, what it's going to do is put a dark line across the building or across the headland. Now, here's a couple of shots shot with G&D filters where we can see before and after, or a with and without, just to give you an idea of what the filter can achieve. Now, this image is shot with a medium graduated filter. You can see there's no clearly defined horizon line. There's a mountain that's breaking the horizon. And you can see this has done a great job on the right-hand side of bringing back that detail in the sky without affecting the exposure of the foreground too much. So here's another one, which was shot with a soft G&D. You can see without it, the sky is completely blown out because it's quite a bright sky. So what this has allowed us to do is bring that detail back in the sky. Now, as I mentioned earlier, G&D filters work best with a square filter system. We do make circular ones, we make one as well, but they can be very difficult to use because you cannot slide them up and down. It really dictates where your composition is if you can't move a grad filter up and down because the line or the graduation is in the middle of the frame all the time. Usually what we want to try and do is shoot with either more foreground or more sky, so it's not a 50-50 split. So that's why a grad filter is much better using it with a square filter system. Square filter systems also have lots of other benefits over circular filters. A couple of reasons that we recommend them is because you can stack multiple filters without vignetting. And you can also use the same filter over many lenses by just using an adapter ring. But one of the biggest benefits is that you can slide a GND filter up and down. Now, the best way to use a graduated filter is to start with the filter very high in the holder and slowly push it down. Watch the result on the back of the LCD screen and make sure the filter only impacts the brightest part of the scene. If you see the filter starting to darken the foreground or the darker part of the scene, you've probably pushed the filter down too far. So if you're still with me, if you've got any questions on graduated filters, feel free to jump in and ask.
All right, Andrew, we've got a question. Can the NiSi filters be used in a Lee holder?
Yeah, so our filters are exactly the same size as Lee filters. They can definitely be used in Lee holders. One thing you'll just need to keep in mind with Lee holders is they're designed to hold resin graduated filters, which are quite a bit lighter than optical glass filters. So you may just have to make some adjustments to the clips on the front. They have screws on the front where you can tighten the clips and just make sure that the filter's held in tightly before you let go of the filter. But they definitely work.
All right, the next question, Andrew. So
Yeah.
when would you use a GND filter over an ND filter?
So an ND filter or a 10-stop ND1000 filter is used to extend the exposure time or to create an effect, whereas the graduated filter is used when you've got a difference in exposure between the sky and the foreground. So one's used to change the exposure time completely or capture movement or an effect, and one's used to balance the exposure between the brightest and darkest part of the scene.
Cool. A bit more of a technical question here. So how do you expose with a reverse grad? So a reverse graduated ND.
Yep. So what you want to do is make sure you expose for your foreground because you want your foreground to be exposed. If your exposure is too dark on the foreground and then you add the reverse grad filter, what's going to happen is the foreground is going to be too dark. Even though your sky may be balanced, the foreground will be too dark. So what I suggest you do is you expose for your foreground, make sure that looks good, and then when you put the reverse grad in, it should balance the exposure out in the sky. If it doesn't, you will probably need a slightly darker reverse ND filter.
All right, next question. What is the most useful density for a graduated ND?
Yeah, it's a question we get a lot. The most popular by far is definitely a 3-stop or a 0.9 density graduated filter. It'll do a pretty good job in most situations. If you're shooting in quite bright conditions, sunrise and sunset, you may consider a 4-stop. And I typically find a lot of people buy 4-stops in medium grads because they do shoot a lot at sunrise and sunset. But typically I find if you're shooting a reverse, a 2-stop is actually quite a great density for a reverse because we find most people don't shoot directly at the sun. but it's still very bright on the horizon line once that sun just drops below the horizon, and 2 stops is great for that. So it really does depend on the conditions you're shooting, but if you find yourself shooting sunrise and sunset a lot, I would definitely consider a 3 or 4 stop. If you shoot after sunrise, after sunset, or before sunrise, maybe a 2 stop GMD.
All right, and one more question, mate. One that we get asked a lot as well. Is there a benefit of using a NiSi GND filter over the graduated filter tool in Lightroom?
Yeah, you can do some changes of exposure in post-production, yes. But in some situations, if dynamic range is quite different between the foreground and the sky, what you'll find on your histogram is the sky is, or parts of the sky are completely blown out, are completely white. So what will happen, as I mentioned before, when we're talking about histograms, is that they will stay white, those pixels, even in post-production, no matter how dark you put a grad filter on in Photoshop or Lightroom, you won't be able to bring detail back in those whites. So what a graduated filter will do is ensure that there's detail in camera before we get to post-production. And I always teach and always believe that our job as a photographer is to get the best exposed image in camera as we possibly can, because it gives us the most options in post-production later. Any other questions about GND filters?
There is one more here. So in what situation would you use a GND and not an ND1000? I'm going to guess any. So in what situation would you use a graduated neutral density and not an ND filter of any kind?
Definitely there's times shooting sunrise and sunset where that color lasts for a fleeting moment or a couple of minutes at the most. And I typically find myself shooting at those really great times of sunrise and sunset where the sky is lit up amazing just with a GND filter. Because I want to take as many shots as I possibly can of that amazing light. So if you were to add an ND filter into that, it'll extend your shutter speed, which means you're probably not getting, you may only get 1 or 2 shots while that light is amazing. So I hope that answered that question. Cool. So next up is one of our most popular filters, called the CPL filter, or circular polarizer. Now these come in many shapes and sizes. We have polarizers for phones, for drones, and to suit almost any lens that you can buy. Most of our square filter systems also include a CPL when you buy the square filter system. And in that case, it's designed to work in harmony with the square filter system. Now, polarizing filters reduce glare from water, wet surfaces, or shiny surfaces that are non-metallic. They're most effective at 90 degrees from the light source. So be aware when you use a CPL, you may not see it working or not see the effect in every situation because of the angle of light. Now, CPL filters can also be used to darken blue skies, typically shooting with longer focal lengths. When you're shooting with wider focal lengths, because of the field of view, a polarizer can't polarize correctly over the entire field of view. And it will give you a kind of a blotchy, darker blue area over the blue sky. And that happens with every single CPL of every single brand, and it's because of the focal length. So what we suggest is if you want to darken a sky shooting on a really wide angle lens, definitely a graduated filter is the best way to go. But I do recommend a polarizer when you're shooting around water or shooting any scene that's got green foliage in it. So like this example, this was shot at Horseshoe Falls in Tassie. The CPL filter has removed the glare from the water but it's also increased the saturation in the greens. You can see they're quite vibrant and green. This next example, you can see a with and without. This one was shot at a place called Oha on the South Island of New Zealand. And you can see the glare has been removed from the top of the water. And what that does is it allows us to see through the water better and reveal the detail under the rocks. Now, in this example, a CPL filter has been used on a telephoto lens to darken that blue sky. And because it's a compressed view, it does a great job at darkening that sky. It can make the sky look bluer, more saturated, and it can also make the intensity of the color in the foreground seem a bit more intense. Now, here's another example which combines two uses of the CPL in one shot. Here you can see the glare on the water has been reduced, bringing back that beautiful aqua color. And then the green on the trees on either side of the frame, the saturation's been increased. The CPL has removed the glare from the shiny leaves, and that's how it brings back that increased saturation and brings back that great green color when you're shooting around foliage. Now, how a CPL works is that typically you can rotate the CPL. It's got a special frame on the front of a filter, or if you're using a square filter system, there's a gear that allows you to rotate the CPL. Now, if you're shooting 90 degrees to the light source, what you'll see is that the reflection or the glare or that white glow on water will completely disappear. So you can see this example. On the left is no CPL, on the right is with a CPL. So this is a great example of an image where I believe a filter, while it's done its job in removing that glare off the water, actually I think it was better shot without a filter. And the reason is in this shot, I was trying to use this grass that was peeking through the water as my foreground. When I actually spun my CPL to remove that glare, it's actually brought in that detail from underneath the water, but what it's done is it's just blended it all in. So I really can't see that sea plant peeking through the water there, and I've lost my foreground element. So a CPL, perfect when you're shooting around water, perfect for anything shiny that's not metallic. Great on beaches that are wet or rocks that are wet. Definitely recommended for seascape photography. Also, a CPL is great when you're shooting interiors inside. It can do a great job at removing that glare off cabinets in say you're doing a real estate shot, kitchen cabinets or desks or something like that. Also off windows or glass, if you're shooting through, say, a car window or through a shop window, or through a shop, sitting down having a coffee through a cafe window. Now, if you've got any questions about CPLs, I'd love to answer those as well.
All right, we've got a couple here, Andrew. So, is there a lens focal width where it is recommended to not use a CPL, such as any super wide angle lenses?
Yeah, so definitely on wide angle lenses, if you're shooting a blue sky, definitely it's not recommended. And it's really anything over about 35 mil, you'll start to see what's called banding. But there are other situations where if you're in a total forest situation and there's no blue sky, you can definitely use a polarizer on a wide angle lens in that situation. And typically there's a spot which you want to focus the CPL, which is where the most of the glare is, and it'll typically be in the foreground or what takes up most of your shot. So it doesn't matter that it doesn't have effect over the entire image. My suggestion is to really focus it on what is the interest in your image. But definitely that foliage or in a forest, that's a perfect situation to shoot with a wide angle lens and a polarizer. But on a blue sky, anything over about 35 mil, you will see that banding with any polarizer from any brand.
All right. Next one. Can you explain the difference between NiSi's CPL filters? Some of the kits seem to have different CPLs. Which CPL is NiSi's best or most premium CPL?
Yeah. So our filter holders typically come with two CPLs. Now, the first one is called a Pro CPL. The Pro CPL, I guess, is our standard CPL. It uses a polarizing film that gives a warmer tone like a traditional polarizer does. The filter doesn't have as many coatings as some of our other polarizers as well, so it can be a little bit harder to clean. And that CPL comes in our starter kit, but in all of our other kits, you typically get our more premium polarizer, which is called our landscape polarizer. Now, what our landscape polarizer is that it's got a special polarizing film that is a cooler tone. So it will be a bluer, cooler tone compared to a traditional polarizer of almost any brand that typically is warmer. We find that cooler tones are much better for landscape photographers. And this filter will also increase saturation more than a standard polarizer or our Pro CPL. And it's also got some better coatings on it to make it a bit easier to clean. The last polarizer that we do have, it's not in any of our filter kits, but we do have in just a circular form is called the natural CPL. And this CPL sits basically in terms of color in the middle of the two. So while the Pro CPL is on the warmer side, the landscape CPL is on the cooler side. The natural CPL is the closest thing to what your eye will see. Very little color change.
Cool. All right, so next question, a bit of a technical one again. Can you use a CPL with stitched images if the camera orientation is fixed? So is it a good idea to use a CPL when you're stitching panoramic images?
Yeah, again, it depends what you're shooting. You're going to obviously see it. It'll be very evident if you're shooting a blue sky, because what will happen is as you rotate to take that stitched image, the polarizer is going to have a different effect because the angle of light's changing. So you will see a difference on a pano. My suggestion is you probably don't use a CPL when you're shooting pano images. But if you're shooting in a forest scene, because there's just so much that makes up that composition, there's no flat color like a blue sky, you may not see it as much, and you may get away with using a polarizer in a forest scene, shooting a pano.
Cool. All right, next question. So would you use a CPL for metallic product shots, mirrors, etc.? So would you use a CPL for metallic surfaces?
Yeah, so CPLs don't work on metallic surfaces. That's basically the only surface they don't work on. Say you've got a building is a great example where there's glass windows, and then there's metal on that building around those glass windows. It'll work on the window, but it's not going to work on the metal. Definitely for metallic products, it's not going to work. But for glass products, so if you're shooting a wine bottle or something like that, it will definitely work. But also, if you are shooting a metallic product, it could work on the area around that product. So say you're shooting it on a table and there's a lot of glare, it could remove the glare from the table as an example, but it won't on the product. Yep. Any other questions?
Cool. No, that's all of them for now.
Cool. Okay. So next up is our natural night filter. So our night filter removes yellow and orange light from the visible light spectrum to control light pollution. Like all our filters, there's times where I would recommend using it and when not to use it. It does a great job at removing light pollution, allowing you to shoot the Milky Way in areas close to a city that would otherwise be very, very difficult with the amount of light pollution. But if I'm shooting in an absolute dark sky, I wouldn't use the natural night myself. So again, with filters, knowing when to use it and when not to use it is part of getting to know your filter. Now, I know a graph is getting a bit more technical for an intro to filters, but just bear with me. I'll explain this to you because it's a great way to see how the filter actually works. Now, on the left of this chart, we have what is called light transmission. So the percentage of light that passes through the filter. On the bottom, we've got the wavelengths of light, which is measured in nanometers or 1/1000th of a meter. So very, very small. Now, the peaks in the graph show us where light is passing through and the filter's not really having an effect. The valleys in the graph are where the light is being restricted and it's not passing through the filter. So in the chart here for the natural night filter, you can see that there's a big valley between 550 and 600 nanometers. And that's where the natural night filter does most of its work. Now, if I overlay the color spectrum, you can see where that big dip is at 550 to 600, the kind of colors that it filters out. So it really works on that yellow, orange, and a tiny bit of the greens as well. So that's how the filter works, what it filters out. You can see from the rest of the color spectrum that it doesn't have much effect at filtering out the other colors. It's mainly that orange and yellow, and that's why it's great to get rid of light pollution, particularly shooting Milky Way images or night images around the city. So here's an example shot with the natural night filter in the middle of the city. You can see that yellow light, it just reflects everywhere. It reflects off the clouds, particularly if it's overcast, and it can have quite an impact on an image. Some clouds can turn that brown color when you're shooting night images, when they reflect the lights, no matter what your white balance is set to. This is an example of using the natural night filter for an astro shot. You can see that there's quite a lot of yellow light pollution and it affects the clouds. And this image has really brought back the contrast between the stars and the sky. So the stars really stand out. Now it's quite a simple filter, our natural night filter. It's almost a one-trick pony, you could say. You use it at nighttime, it gets rid of orange and yellow color. It's not a filter you can use during the day. You can use it during the day, but really it's not going to have a lot of effect. It will get rid of some of the yellow or orange colors. I have seen some great examples of it being used for interior shots as well. If there's that really harsh yellow light, say you're shooting in a church or something like that, it'll really help to remove some of that yellow light as well. Does anyone have any questions about the natural night filter?
We've got a few coming through here about the natural night. So what's the recommended white balance to use the natural night filter in?
Yeah, so when we get ready to take a shot using the natural night, I always recommend shooting with a daylight white balance. and that'll get you the best result out of the night filter. It's also good because setting a constant white balance, you can also take the filter off and see the effect that it's having.
Okay, so next question. Does the natural night filter enhance northern lights photos?
What it can do is if you're shooting in an area where there is light pollution, it will enhance that shot to an extent because it's going to bring back some of the contrast with stars, and it's going to remove that yellow tone. But one thing to keep in mind is the natural night filter does add about almost one stop of light. So it will affect your exposure time, which can have an impact when shooting the northern lights. So just something to keep in mind. Again, if you're in a totally dark situation, just like I mentioned before, shooting Astro or the Milky Way, I probably wouldn't use it. But if you're in an area that's got quite a lot of light pollution from, say, a town or a city, definitely it would be a great tool.
Okay, next question. So when using my natural night filter to shoot cityscape CBD shots, I find that I get a slight pink cast if I use auto white balance. However, when I use a set Kelvin value of say 4200 Kelvin, this doesn't occur. Are you able to elaborate why?
Yeah, so
slight cast in auto white balance.
Yeah, definitely shooting with a constant white balance is better. And I've mentioned shooting with a daylight white balance. What happens is the filter does remove some greens as well, so it can give a bit of a purple tinge in some white balance situations. But I definitely find if you set a constant white balance of daylight, it will reduce that quite a bit.
All right, and last question about the natural night filter.
Yeah.
In the filter system, does the CPL have to fit under the natural night filter?
Now, I've been asked this question quite a few times using a polarizer with a natural night filter. And one thing I just want to, I guess, let you know is that in most situations when you're shooting with a night filter, it's at nighttime. So you're really not getting light. You're really not getting any glare because there's a lot less light than when you're shooting during the day. So there are probably a few situations where a polarizer would help when you're shooting at nighttime, but most of the time, probably 99% of the time, I would recommend not using a polarizer because at night, it's really not going to have too much effect. Cool.
Cool question.
Now, one feature of a filter that's commonly overlooked that can have a massive impact on using a filter is the coating that's on a filter. It's sometimes called a multi-coating, or in NiSi's case, it's called a nano coating. Now, the nano coating repels water, dust, and dirt. And for seascape photographers, it can be a difference between getting a shot or not, because it makes the filter super easy to clean, to wipe off that spray in between shots. Here on this image, you can see, so the image on the right has a nano coating. The image on the left doesn't have a coating. So what a nano coating does is that the water and the dirt is that it beads up on the outside and it literally doesn't stick to the filter. It just slides straight off. So it makes it almost a repelling feature, where it will even repel things like permanent marker. If I do this all the time when I go and see dealers when I'm talking to them about filters. If you pull out a Sharpie, you can write on one of our square filters and it'll rub straight off. even a permanent marker, because the nano coating is so good, it won't even let a permanent marker actually stick to it. So I just wanted to show you a quick video on how that nano coating works. Cool, so you can see the benefits of having a nano coating on a filter, particularly for seascape photographers. It's one of the things we get told the most, that the filters are so easy to clean, and it makes shooting seascapes much easier. Now, I don't want to get too technical about filters, but what the filter is made from makes a difference. It makes a huge difference in the sharpness of the image, particularly with cameras increasing in megapixels. We find that resin filters, you really start to see a breakdown in sharpness once you start getting around the 40 to 50 megapixels in particular. So our filters are made of an optical glass, which is the same glass that you find inside optics of a lens. Allows maximum sharpness. Another feature to consider when you're looking at filters is any reflective coating. Reflections can destroy an image if there's any reflective coating. You can get reflections in your image of the inside of the lens. Glare reflects as well. So here's an example. You can see there's a leaf filter on the left. The reflection is quite strong, and then a NiSi filter on the right. One of the questions we get asked the most is what filter system is the best? And we make lots of different filter systems, and we make something to suit almost every camera or every person. We make a full range of circular filters from different sizes, from 40 mil up to 112 mil. We make filter systems for mobile phones, for compact cameras, like the X100 or RX100, for very small filter threads as well, from 39 to 49. We make for compact cameras, mirrorless cameras, we make a 75 mil system, great for standard filter threads from 39 to 67. And our most popular system is a 100 mil square filter system, which works on filter threads from 46 to 95. Most photographers love circular filters. They're easy to use, carry, and they suit many people. But after using circular filters for some time, you will come to realize that there's some limits. And a square filter system can usually solve this. And as I mentioned, that we usually recommend a square filter system. They're great at allowing you to stack multiple filters to avoid vignetting. And with an adapter, you can use it over multiple lenses. Now, on our website, we have a lens lookup tool that allows you to look up your brand and particular lens and see which holders it's compatible with. So if you jump on our website, nisifilters.com.au, you can go to the menu option, which NiSi system, and there you'll be able to search for every lens and go through your lenses and work out which system is compatible and work out which one over the lenses that you have is going to be the most suitable. We're always available to help answer any questions you have about filter holder systems. But one thing that you definitely want to consider is when you're choosing a system is work out what your widest focal length lens is and base your system on that widest lens. Typically, we're using our filter system with the wider angle lenses more than any other lens. It's going to get the most use when we're shooting landscape images, and you want your filter system to be compatible with that wide angle lens that you're finding yourself using the most when you're shooting landscape shots. Now, does anyone have any questions on filter systems or which filter system is the best for a particular situation?
We have the question back to the coding. I guess this one kind of covers that. So does NiSi have an infrared filter, and how good is it with a digital? How good is it with a digital camera? So I guess we're comparing two different things here between our IR coding and a specific infrared filter.
Yeah, so NiSi doesn't make an infrared filter. The reason we don't is because that most modern cameras these days, they do have a filter in front of the sensor that will help filter out a lot of the IR light. But you can buy other brands an IR filter that can get you an IR effect, but it may not be compatible with every camera, depending if your camera has one of those special coatings over the sensor.
Cool. Another question. So is the nano, sorry, questions are rolling too fast here now. Is the nano coating also on the landscape and other NiSi CPL filters?
Yeah, it's on every CPL filter that we offer. It is even on the Pro CPL, but the amount of coatings is less than what's on our landscape CPL. So just the it just makes it a little bit easier to clean the landscape CPL, but every other CPL that we offer also has the nano coating on it as well. Almost every filter that we do offer has nano coating, with some exceptions. And some of them are example, our black mist filter doesn't, and our streak filter. And those are ones that are typically shooting into light. And we find the nano coating can have a slightly increased reflection when you're shooting into light. So that's the reason those filters don't.
Cool. All right. Does NiSi make a square natural night filter?
Yes, we do. We have in all different sizes and square filters. We have some very small for mobile phones or compact cameras, right up 75mm system, 100mm system, 150 and 180mm square filter system. So everything.
Awesome. Why are graduated ND filters not available in densities higher than 4 stops?
Yeah, so typically when you're shooting sunrise and sunset, if you do a measure, you'll find that at the brightest part of sunrise and sunset, the density difference between the foreground and the sky at the max is probably about 5 stops. Now, most modern day cameras can definitely, they've got quite a good dynamic range, and you can definitely bring back some detail as long as it's not pure white or pure black pixels. And what we find is a 3 or 4 stop is a really good fit, along with what the dynamic range that cameras do have these days. If we had a density that was much larger than that, what you'll find is that the sky is going to be far too dark.
Right. Is it possible to combine circular ND filters with a square graduated neutral density filter? So is it possible to use a circular screw-on ND and then add a square ND on the front?
Yeah. Technically, yes, it's possible. but what you would have to do is first screw in your circular ND filter into the lens, then screw the square filter system onto that circular filter. Now there's two, I guess, downsides when you do that. The first one is that if you're shooting on a wide angle lens, if you've got a circular filter between the square filter system and the lens, it could bring vignetting into the image, which is basically, because it pushes the filter system away from the lens, you may start to see the filter holder in your image. Secondly, circular filters are not really designed to hold the weight of a square filter system. So you are putting your filter system at risk. I would definitely recommend screwing a square filter system directly into the lens.
Cool. Are there any filter systems for domed or non-standard threaded lenses, like a Samyang 14mm?
Yeah. So our 150 and 180mm system are designed for those exact lenses, ones that don't have filter threads. And how they work is they actually fit over the entire bulbous front, and they actually attach on the outside of the lens. Our system we've got is called S6 system, and we've got a Q system for some lenses as well. Both systems you can mount on the lens without taking the lens off the camera, which is a great benefit. But that's specifically what those systems are designed for. Those lenses that don't have filter threads, that have that bulbous front, and they allow you to use filters when you wouldn't be able to before.
Cool. All right. Now, is the 100mm square filter system large enough for the new Canon RF 16 to 35mm lens?
Yeah, it sure is. You'll be able to use the 100mm system on that lens. Our 100mm system, actually, the way it's designed is quite cool. It actually pushes the filter holder almost to where a circular filter would sit. So actually on the 16 to 35, there's no vignetting, even at 16mm. So it's the perfect choice for that lens.
Cool. Awesome. Now, I have both the Nikon Z and the Nikon F mount 14 to 24mm f2.8 lenses. What mount size or what filter sizes would you recommend for those two lenses?
Yeah, so we have a range of options, but if you want to use the one filter system over both of those two different mounts, I would recommend our 150mm system. The F mount, we only have a 150mm option because of how large the lens is and how big the lens hood is. It doesn't allow a 100mm system to work with that lens. So a 150mm system we have, and it will work for both of those lenses. We do have a 100mm system for the Z 14 to 24, but that would mean you have to buy two systems. And there's also a benefit in using the 150mm system across both of those. With the Z mount, it allows you to do two filters plus a CPL, whereas the 100mm system only allows two filters with no built-in CPL. So 150mm system is definitely the best choice for you.
Awesome. All right. So when purchasing a filter system, do we base it on the widest lens or widest focal length we plan to purchase? Say I have a 16mm now, and in future I plan to get a Sony 12mm. How would I plan for this?
Yeah, so definitely think about the future, because your filters will usually last you many, many years. So if you know you're going to get a wider lens, like a 12mm, I would definitely base your decision off that 12mm, off the widest lens that you have or you think you're going to get in the near future. The reason for that is, an example would be if you had a 16 to 35, it's great for a 100mm system, but if you were to go up to, say, a Sony 12mm, the 100mm system won't work. So you would need to buy a second system or replace your system. So at the start of your decision making, I would suggest that you look at the 150mm system, And the 150mm system can be used on standard filter threads as well, using a standard filter thread adapter. So that will allow you to work across both of those two lenses. Any other questions?
All right, now we've got quite a few models in our lineup. So the V6, V5, and V5 Pro. What do all of these mean, and what are the differences?
Yeah, so all of the ones you mentioned there are a 100mm square filter system. Basically, we started with a V3 and we made some improvements and had feedback from a photographer. We brought out the V5. Same thing happened a couple of years later, the V5 Pro, and we're up to the V6. So the V6 is our latest model. And actually, it's the only model you can buy new in Australia at the moment. The V5 Pro is discontinued, but the V6 has got heaps of benefits over the V5 Pro. It's got a lock, so you can lock off the filter system so it doesn't rotate. It's designed in a way to make it easier to get that ND filter that's closest to the lens in and out as well. And a few other changes, but that's the main one. So I definitely suggest you look at the V6.
Cool. Awesome. Now, does NiSi have any filters for sun or moon eclipses?
We don't make a specific filter for that. You can use a 20 stop which we do make for that. But we don't make a specific one that we brand just for the eclipses. But you're looking at the range of about 20 stops is what you want to look at. Now, I might keep going. I've got a little bit more I want to share with you. I'll come back to any other questions at the end if you don't mind. So just quickly, as we're almost at the end here, I just wanted to mention our close-up lenses. They've been a staple throughout lockdowns, which most of us have found ourselves in for a long period of time over the last couple of months. They've been so popular, our factory just cannot keep up with the demand. They're a great product to check out. So this image was shot with a 70-200 telephoto lens. Normally, the minimum focus distance is about 1.4 meters. But when we use a close-up lens, it reduces the focus distance to about 20 centimeters. So if we're shooting with a 200mm with a focus distance at 20 centimeters, you can imagine it gets us quite close to our subject. And it gives our telephoto lens a whole new lease on life. It's simple. It's just like a filter. You screw it in, and at 200mm, as an example, on a 70-200, it'll give you a 1-to-1 macro ratio using our 77mm close-up lens. We also make a 58mm close-up lens, and that one has a slightly increased diopter, which basically means it will get you a little bit closer, and it pairs really well with macro lenses. For example, the 100mm Canon macro, the 90mm Sony macro, the 105 Nikon macro, and other small lenses that have a smaller filter thread. Here's another example where you can see the shot on the left was shot at the minimum focus distance. And then when we add the close-up lens, it reduces that minimum focus distance. And you can see the difference that it makes being able to get much closer to the subject. You can see details that you wouldn't see in the first image. And it blurs out that background beautifully to really make your subject pop. It's a great product to try, and I recommend if you can get your hands on one. It's difficult at the moment, but it's great to experiment in the backyard during lockdown. Here's a quick video just on the macro lens, just to show you some of the things you can achieve with it. final filter I wanted to touch on is a new release for us. It's called the Black Mist filter. It is a very simple example to see how the Black Mist filter works and what can be achieved. You can see on the left, there's no filter. On the right is the black mist. And what it does is it basically blooms around highlights. It is great for shooting with light in your image or shooting at nighttime. Here's another example where it shows the differences between the different strengths. So it reduces contrast. As well as if you look from the left where there's no filter, you can see the round shape that the light's making. And as you increase the strength, you can see that bloom that is around the light source. So you can't actually see the really defined strong light source anymore. It's a great filter to use in portraits. You can use it shooting night landscape images as well. A really cool filter to try out. Now the black mist lowers contrast, bloom highlights, and the other thing I didn't mention is that it softens skin and it'll give that image a cinematic look. Now here's a couple of examples that I just want you to have a quick look at. Now in this image, I'm just going to go between with and without, and I want you to have a look at the light hanging from the ceiling and then the table lamp also in the front left of the image. So you can see the difference that it makes on this image. It really blooms around those lights, and it removes the definition from the lights as well and really gives it a nice cinematic look. So here's a quick video just on the black mist where you can see a few more examples.
As a master of your craft, you're always wanting to create without limits. Get into a flow state and make your ideas come to life. We are always on the hunt to capture the most striking images possible, and the NiSi Black Mist filter allows us to do just that. These black mist filters bloom highlights, soften skin, and give your shots an organic film-like effect. Coming in 3 strengths, 1/8, 1/4, and 1/2 gives you the option to choose the filter that will match perfectly with your shooting environment. These 3 strengths work together to give you versatility when it comes to your creative style, help you advance your filmmaking and photography skills, and are a perfect addition to your kit. As a creative, we want to catch the uncatchable, obtain the unobtainable, and these NiSi Black Mist filters get out of your way so you can create without limits.
So that's pretty much it from me tonight. I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate taking the night to hear a little bit about filters and from us. We do have a free filter guide available. If you go to nisifilters.com.au guide, you'll be able to access that on nisifilters.com.au. And just a reminder, there's 20% off as well with our lockdown sale at the moment, so a great time to buy. And if you've got any other questions, I would love to answer them now.
Andrew, there was a question a little bit earlier that's probably a good one to touch on here at the end about what would you use or what would you recommend to keep your filters clean?
Yeah, so the nano coating makes the filters very easy to clean. What you can do is actually just put them under tap water. That will usually get rid of a lot of dirt or dust that's on them, and then just let them dry or pat them dry with a microfiber cloth. Secondly, we actually make a couple of different cleaning solutions. The first one is basically just a very light detergent with a distilled water. And that one is great for all lenses, for anything nano coated. It won't damage any filter or any lens. And you can spray it directly on the filter and wipe it, and there's no streaks. It'll clean absolutely beautifully. It's available on our website. We also have a new one, which is called a nano cleaning solution, which we've just released. This one is a bit more premium in terms of cleaning. What this one does is it puts a protective coating over your nano coating as well, just to help protect it a little bit more. Both of those are available on our website. So we also have, if you go on our blog, there's a great article there that talks about how to clean your filters. So on the blog on nisifilters.com.au, it goes through all the steps, but you can use anything from tap water up to a non-alcohol based cleaning solution. Any other questions? Feel free to turn on your microphone and ask the question if you want to as well.
No, that might be it, mate. I think you've answered all the questions. It was a good presentation. So
Awesome. Well, there's one I've just seen come in.
Does the 5 Pro, so does the V5 Pro 100mm system have the nano effect on them?
Yeah, so the filter holder doesn't, but the filters that would have come with the holder, they will have the nano effect, the nano coating. So an easy way to check, put a few drops of water on your filter and you'll see it beating up. When you tip the filter up, they'll just slide straight off. So you'll be able to see the nano filter working.
Cool. And yeah, a couple of people have asked as well just where to view this presentation afterwards. So there was a link sent out with this email with a YouTube link. So this will be live up on YouTube straight after this as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So the link that you received in that email, or if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll be able to check it out there.
Now, also just another question here, Andrew. Is there any discount code for the 20% discount that we're currently running?
No, it's automatic. So if you just go to our website, it'll automatically, when you add a product to cart, it'll give you the 20% discount. We've got an ongoing sale at the moment for lockdown. We know there's a lot of people in lockdown and struggling, and our business has been locked down for the last 8 weeks as well. So we've put on a special during that time.
And just one more quick question here. Does the landscape CPL filter come in a variety of sizes?
It does with our square filter systems, but the same technology is actually in another CPL we have called the TI CPL, or a titanium frame CPL. That one is got the landscape CPL polarizing film in it, and it comes in sizes from 67 to 95. So that's another option if you want that cooler tone. Otherwise, we do make a couple of other polarizers in almost every size, including the natural CPL, which is the one I would suggest you look at. It's our new one, and it's a very color neutral CPL. Cool. I think I saw one too about lens caps for a close-up lens. We've made an update to the close-up lens where we've brought out a second version that comes with lens caps. But if you have the first version, you can just get any 77mm generic lens caps will actually work on the close-up lens. One for the front, one for the back. I think that's it. Well, I just again want to say thank you so much for joining us. It's amazing that you would take an hour and a half out of your time to hear from me and to listen about filters. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We're always here to help. If you have any questions about filters at any time, please feel free, jump on our website, go to the Contact Us page. There's a phone number on the Contact Us page. Feel free to give us a call. We have live chat on our website during business hours as well. We would love to answer any questions that you might have. But thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your night.
I don't know if you can hear me or not, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Great night. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks
Awesome.
very much.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so
Cheers,
much.
guys.
Thank you. Thank you very
Bye,
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks
Good
very
night.
much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Lovely photo, Rod.
There's a few familiar faces.
Definitely, and in the chat as well. It's good to see a lot of people.
Yeah, it is. As I said at the start, after being locked down for 8 weeks, this is the most people I've seen together at once.
It is. It's pretty tough. So.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. Have a good night.
Night.
Hey, Tim. Thanks for joining us.